Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the New Voices, New Rooms, Look Who's in Town panel. Thank you all for spending your dinner hour with us. We have a wonderful panel of authors tonight: Geraldine Brooks, Elliott Dark, Isaac Fitzgerald, and Michael W. Twitty, all of whom will be discussing their forthcoming books that are publishing this summer. My name is Amanda Toronto, and I am a bookseller at WORD Bookstores in Brooklyn, New York, and Jersey City, New Jersey. I'm so excited to introduce you to our panelists, but before we begin, I wanted to take a minute to thank the publisher sponsors of this panel, Viking, Simon & Schuster, Bloomsbury, and Amistad. We truly appreciate all the time and effort it took to bring this panel together. And I also wanted to thank the NABA and SIBA boards, Linda Marie and Eileen, for putting together these past 2 days of programming and for giving us the time and the space to discuss books and to come together and hear about books that will be entering into the world in a few months. I wanted to encourage booksellers, any booksellers who are beaming in, to tell us in the chat where you're from, what bookstore you're from, where you're coming from. There is not going to be a question and answer session after this panel, but if you have any comments you would like to, if you have any comments, we will be make sure that the comments that you have get to the authors after the chat. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our first author, Geraldine Brooks. Geraldine Brooks is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel March and the international bestsellers The Secret Chord, Caleb's Crossing, People of the Book, and Year of Wonders. She has also written the acclaimed nonfiction works 9 Parts of Desire and Foreign Correspondence. Born and raised in Australia, Brooks lives in Massachusetts. Her forthcoming novel Horse is publishing this June. So Geraldine, would you like to tell us a little bit about your book?
Sure, I would love to. And I just want to say it is great to be with you for dinner. I wish it was a real dinner, but maybe that will come very soon, I hope. But it's good to share some time with you virtually. So this book was like a gift. It came to me right when I was getting absolutely no work done because my midlife crisis turned out to be not a red Mustang, but a little black pony. I became a horse crazy girl in my middle ages, and I was totally neglecting work on the novel I was supposed to be writing. But I got invited to go to Plymouth Plantation and the museum that had helped me a lot when I was researching my book, Caleb's Crossing. And so I was invited to lunch, and their purpose in inviting me was to pitch me an idea for a novel about a young woman from the plantation. But I realized right away that that wasn't going to work because I'd already written that book in Caleb's Crossing. So I'm sitting there nodding and smiling politely, but my attention instead was diverted to somebody sitting further down the table who was telling an extraordinary story about a racehorse from the 1850s. This gentleman was from the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, and he was regaling his end of the table with the story of how he had just transported the skeleton of this 1850s champion racehorse from Washington to the International Museum of the Horse in Kentucky. And as he unspooled the story of the horse and what had happened to the horse in the Civil War, my luncheon companion realized that they didn't have a scintilla of my attention anymore, because it was not going to be about this girl from Plymouth Plantation. It was going to be about this racehorse. And I went home determined to learn more. And I realized that it was a story about a racehorse, but it was also a story about the extraordinarily talented Black horsemen of the time whose expertise and skills were being plundered to create the wealth of the white plantation owners who raced these horses and drew immense financial remuneration and also prestige from the horses. And so I dived into the historical story, and then I knew that there would be a contemporary thread about the science around the bones of this horse at the Smithsonian. And then I learned about a painter who had painted this horse and the Black Horseman, the trainers and the grooms who were responsible for his success. And that led me on a wild chase after a missing painting of the horse and his black groom, Jarrett. And that the idea of this black groom became the animating force of the historical story, whereas the story of the painting unexpectedly took me to New York City in the 1950s and the birth of the abstract expressionist movement and a feminist art gallery owner who was the supporter of contemporary art but was linked to this painting of the horse, and also the science at the Smithsonian. And then I realized that I couldn't leave the story of race in the past as if it was something over and done with. I had to also reflect the reverberations about race and injustice that are continuing today. So the book carried me away, and I can't wait for you to read it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Before I forget again, because I forgot when I did the introductions, I wanted to say that all of these galleys, these e-galleys, are available for booksellers to download, and it is the link to the galleys are in the chat. So I strongly encourage each and every one of you to get your hands on these galleys and read these books before they come out. Our next author is Alice Elliott Dark. Alice Elliott Dark is the author of Think of England and 2 collections of short stories, In the Gloaming and Naked to the Waist. Her award-winning story In the Gloaming was made into 2 films. One was directed by Christopher Reeve and starred Glenn Close, Bridget Fonda, Whoopi Goldberg, and Robert Sean Leonard. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, Harper's, The New York Times, Best American Short Stories, and O. Henry Prize Stories, among others. Dark is a past recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. She is an associate professor at Rutgers-Newark in the MFA program, and Fellowship Point is her first book in 20 years and will be published in July. Alice, can you talk a little bit about how you came up with the idea for this book and tell us a little bit about this book?
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be here to talk about the book a little bit. I started this book in 2011 after trying a couple novels that didn't pan out. And I had recently watched a miniseries of one of Trollope's books on television, and I just thought, oh, I would love to try to write a 19th century style novel, which was like way ambitious for me because I started as a poet. And, you know, this is like the absolute opposite end of complexity in terms of plot, subplot, and everything. But I just decided I'm interested to do that. So I set that goal, but it was sort of in the back of my mind kind of goal for a while until I had more characters and an idea for what would happen in the book. And the central idea came when I went to visit a friend who had a job with the University of California, and what she was doing was cataloging all the land that had been given to the University of California that had not yet been put in any kind of a database. They just had thousands and thousands of acres of land that was just gifts to the university, and they wanted to make a database so professors and so on could go use it for research. And she told me she's going through all this and visiting all of this land, that so much of this land was given by women to the state. And I thought that was really fascinating. So I started researching history of women and land ownership. And in the United States, it wasn't until the year 1900 that women were allowed to have a say over what happened to the land, that they were allowed to own land starting a little bit earlier, but they couldn't say what was going to happen to it. It was still controlled by father, brother, husband, someone else. So I thought, this is really fascinating. Women have not owned land for very long. And, you know, the fact that they had a different attitude about it, at least that's sort of the thesis I came up with, that they walked more lightly on the land because it just hasn't been theirs for a long time. So I thought that's a great plot, because so many 19th century novels are land plots. And this was a contemporary twist. What happens when two women, my characters Agnes and Polly, who are both 80, what happens when they're in control of a rather sizable and beautiful piece of land, a peninsula in Maine? So the book built from that idea, and it opens with Agnes facing the dilemmas, you know, several dilemmas. She's a writer and she has writer's block. She wants to finish her last novel in a long series of novels she's been writing. She's been writing one every year since she was in her 20s. She wants to do the last one before she dies. And she also has cancer again, which is putting a little pressure on it, although she's one of these very flinty people who, that it's sort of an inconvenience that's happening to her. And then she reads in the paper that a man is actually a developer, is looking at Fellowship Point and has plans for it. So she sets about to try to dissolve this land trust that her great grandfather set up in 1870. And she has to get the agreement of her best friend Polly and her nephew Archie, and they both have reasons not to agree with her. So the book, a lot of the book is about her trying to solve this dilemma, but it's also a big picture of life on Fellowship Point. It goes into her past, Agnes's past. Polly is just as much of a main character as Agnes. Agnes is never married. She's lived a solitary life. It's a rich life, but it's a life of the mind and of nature. Polly's married and has children. She leads a very different kind of life in the world. And then along comes the third main character, who's Maud Silver, who's a young editorial assistant at the company that publishes Agnes's children's books. And she wants Agnes to write a memoir, but Agnes can't do that without talking about some very painful parts of her past that she doesn't want to reveal. So that's kind of the setup and how the plot unfolds, each of these different threads. And the themes that I said are land ownership, land stewardship. Who does our land really belong to, and why and how? Who gets to make those decisions? Agnes and Polly are Quakers, so there's a lot about Quaker traditions and values in the book. And there's also themes of just justice and nature and conservation. And the final thing I'll say is that I was really interested in writing about these older women because I don't think older women get fair treatment in this culture. And I wanted to show very vibrant 80-year-old women who are still making decisions, turning a plot, having a say, changing things and coming into their power when they are, when a lot of people would have put them on the ice floe. They can't do that with these two women. So that's my book. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It's great. I've started reading it. It's wonderful. I've started reading all of these books. They're all amazing. I love hearing about these books. Our next author is Isaac Fitzgerald. Isaac Fitzgerald appears frequently on the Today Show and is the author of the best-selling children's book, How to Be a Pirate, as well as the co-author of Pen and Ink and Knives and Ink. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Best American Non-Required Reading, and numerous other publications. He lives in Brooklyn. His memoir, Dirtbag, Massachusetts, will be published in July. And my question for you is, has your mother read this memoir?
It's a beautiful question, and I deeply appreciate it. It's right here, Dirtbag, Massachusetts. And yes, she has. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how she reacted to it. Because this is a memoir, and it's very much a family memoir, and one has to be mindful of the family stories that one is sharing. One has to be mindful of the way that we talk about our stories, but also understanding that we're sharing other people's stories when one sets out to write about one's own life. So my parents were married when they had me, just to different people. And that is the opening line of this book. The joke that I like to make a lot is that I was a child with passion. And I got to live a very, very unique childhood, which is I came up in inner city Boston in the Catholic Worker, which is a socialist Catholic community that basically tries to help the unhoused, which my parents were both unhoused at the time. I grew up in a place called Haley House, and then not long after that, John Larry House. And it's easy when one thinks about the Catholic Church to think of opulence, which there very much was. My mother worked for the Cathedral of the Holy Cross, which was the seat of the entire Catholic Church in the New England region. But with the Catholic Worker, it's more Thomas Merton. It's more Dorothy Day. It's more about community, sharing, being there for one another. The kind of true teachings of, I mean, not to rip off from Alice, but stewardship and how we take care of one another. But anyways, my family life in my early years was actually very, very happy. And that is when we were poorest. That is when we were living our hardest life, was actually when I have memories of great joy. But eventually around the age of 8, we move out to Western Massachusetts. And for those familiar with the region, what I like to say is, you know how you go like far enough west in Massachusetts, it gets really beautiful. So before there, it's called North Central Massachusetts. And don't get me wrong, I want to be actually very, very clear. The region is beautiful, but what milling and industry did to that region during a certain period of time in this country's history was very, very hard. And then those mills then moved down south, and then they moved out of this country entirely, leaving a pretty destitute population. And so that's where I spent those next years. Family life got hard. And the rest of the book, it's a memoir and essays, is basically about that childhood, how I reacted to that childhood, not seeking help through therapy or anything, but really trying to think that I could just tough man my way through it, realizing, coming to a breaking point, that that is not something I could do. But the most surprising twist for me about this book, and to be honest, in my life that I'm still living right now, is that my family then, that had truly blown apart, finds a way back together. And not in some kind of way that you would think of a family, not that traditional family, but a way that we can all be there together, understanding that all of life is about growth. All of life is about understanding and having new perspectives. And all of life is about not forgiveness, not a rush to forgive, because that's something that's really easy, but having the conversations that might one day bring us to a place of forgiveness. But don't worry, there's also fun stuff in there too. I work at a biker bar. I smuggle medical supplies over the Thai-Burma border. I work at a place called The Armory. If you know, you know. Read the book, you'll figure it out. But it's called Dirtbag, Massachusetts. And I just want to say thank you to all the booksellers that are here tonight. You are the champions that put these books in readers' hands. I myself have worked at a bookstore, so I know what it means to be able to make that connection when you find that right book for the right person. And it means the world to me that you're giving us your time tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Our next author is Michael W. Twitty. Michael W. Twitty is the author of The Cooking Gene, which won the James Beard Award in 2018 for Book of the Year and the James Beard Award for Writing. He is a highly sought after speaker and consultant, and he has appeared on programs such as Bizarre Foods with Andrew Zimmern, Many Rivers to Cross with Henry Louis Gates, Taste the Nation with Padma Lakshmi, and most recently he was on Michelle Obama's show Waffles and Mochi. He is a TED Fellow and was just named as a National Geographic Emerging Explorer. Michael is the host of a masterclass course which premiered in 2021, and his forthcoming book, Kosher Soul, is publishing in August. Michael, what distinguishes Kosher Soul from a cookbook or a conventional food memoir?
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank everybody for being here. I really enjoyed hearing from the other authors, and I'm reminded that a big part of this is about how we tell stories. And it's almost like I want to go to some kind of Bard festival where we all do our thing, right? And talk about it. And I was really touched by everybody's books and what they're working on. So Kosher Soul, I'm going to start with pitching the cover, because the cover, you know, all authors fight over the cover at least once or more in their career. And so mine was, I want the different types of challah on my cover. And I want a gay challah, and I want a black challah, and I want a, Jewish talit challah, and I want a challah that's rainbow, black, Jewish, all the Southern, all of it rolled up into one. And anyone who reads this book, I want them to make sure they know that my husband did these challahs over 20 hours and dyed them perfectly. But also they start to tell the story. And you've never seen a red, black, and green challah. What does that mean? It means that Blackness has a presence and a seat in Jewish life. But it also means that Jewish life, wherever Jewish life is held, whether it's secular or religious, is touched by the cultures around it and is interacting with those cultures. So for me, as a queer, Black, Southern Jewish man, I am not a phoenix or a dragon. We do exist. I wanted to really talk about my own journey and remind people that, I could just do a cookbook with pretty pictures and food porn and say, well, these are the ingredients, these are the how-tos, and wow people. But my biggest fear is ending up in that corner of Michael's with the rest of the cookbooks. That's my big one. But when you write about your personal journey, I think it's obvious that every single one of us brings those parts of our identity to the table. My mother always wanted me to know, what does it mean to be a woman in this society, in this culture? And that affected me deeply, because it let me know that my mother could not walk anywhere, be anywhere, do anything without her identity as a woman and her femininity being judged and being in the presence of the room. And it prepared me for a life where being a Black male accompanies me to every single synagogue. Sometimes it's absolutely welcome. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's how people think about how I process culture. And so for me, food is that vehicle. Food is that sets the table for conversation. But also I think, like Isaac, I'm like, kumbaya isn't the point. Breaking the ice in conversation and wrestling. And that's part of our name. Israel is the wrestling people, the God wrestling people. That's part of it. The conversation as both dialogue and peace treaty, but also conflict. And of course, with food, you can't get, two Jews, let alone one Jew, to agree what the proper recipe for whatever is. But also that goes for African-American folks as well. I mean, I joke that we're the only people who force our children to eat our oppression through horrifying foods like gefilte fish and chitlins. And it's like a big part of this book. And lastly, I wanted to talk about the different ways that food translate from community to community. So one of the most amazing things was, as this book was developed during the pandemic and the you-know-who years, was finding out that in all this talk of how we have nothing in common anymore, I was interviewing other African-American Jews, from a vegan, lesbian rabbi to a Black Orthodox Hasidic rabbi whose family had been Black and Hasidic for 3 generations, to Black Muslim chefs in Philadelphia and New York, to white Protestant Southerners who had converted to Judaism. And what I found out was amazing was all these people who have this Southern heritage from different points of view all felt the incredible need to express that at their table. And the ingredients and the things that they really wanted and liked and desired and wanted to pass on to the next generation were virtually the same. So in all this disunity, I found this incredible sort of like commitment to both faith, community, but also this dietary continuity based around these ancient laws, but in American context. And so after all of that stuff and Sturm und Drang, Kosher Soul has been born. It's out. It's going to be out in the world. Thank God. It's been like elephant gestation. Those of you who don't know, elephants take 2 years to calve. That's why I say elephant gestation. But it's pretty amazing because I've gotten to know amazing people, and I feel like, no, I can't. I originally wanted to give everybody this comprehensive, consistent history of every Black Jew on earth, plus our food story. And I quickly found out that we've been so marginalized, and so the story is so spotty. But when you put all the different pieces of the mosaic together, you get a beautiful work of art, and that's our daily lives. So thank you.
Can I just tell Michael that my son, who is a Black Jew from Ethiopia, refers to it as guilty fish. He said, I like all the food at Passover except the guilty fish.
That's lovely.
It's not too late to put that in the book. Is it too late? It's too late.
I love that. Thank you so much, Michael. I'm really looking forward to finishing your book. A question I had when I was reading through all of your books, and you've all touched on this in some way, but I was wondering if you could just discuss a little bit more in depth the ways you went about researching your books. And I guess just out of sheer curiosity, something interesting that we have 2 novels, we have 2 memoirs, but I was just curious if the sort of one most surprising fact you came across when researching your books that did or did not make it into your books. But mostly I'm just interested in how you went about researching these books, and how maybe that influenced the structure, the narrative, how you put together the books. I guess we can go back to the beginning, Geraldine, if you wouldn't mind starting off the conversation.
Well, one of the things that I discovered resting on the backs of real historians, I have to say, was that this racehorse was probably owned by a Black man. And because a Black person could not race a horse under his own name, it was raced under the name of the man that he worked for. He had been enslaved, but he had bought his own freedom and was working for this man as his trainer as a free man. And he was said to own the racing qualities of this horse, but nobody's very clear about what that meant. And then when the horse turned out to be like absolutely screamingly fast and going to be a champion, lo and behold, there's a document in which the fact that a Black man can't race a horse under his own name at the Kentucky track in question is ticked off by the guy who then ends up owning the horse. So, I speculate, but it's speculation based on historical research, that this horse was plundered from its Black owner. And then in the contemporary time, I just really love getting up in other people's business. And it was so great to go to the Smithsonian. And there's this fantastic place out in Maryland called the Museum Support Center, which is a treasure house of art and science. All the stuff that they don't have in the museums is out there. And so you're sitting in a lab looking at what they do with the bones, and in the corridor goes by a triceratops head one way and an old master's painting by Van Dyck the other way. But in the bone lab, the thing that I discovered that is so great is that for all the scientific advances that we have made in preparing bones for scientific study of DNA, they still rely on bugs to clean the bones. So there's a room called the bug room. Actually, it's called the environmental suite, but everybody calls it the bug room. And you go in there and there are a bunch of domestic beetles eating the flesh off the bones that the scientists will then study. So you couldn't make it up, which is what I love in fiction.
Wow, that sounds like I'm not cut out to work in the Smithsonian if that's how they clean the bones, because I can barely handle it when like a bug enters into my apartment. But that is an amazing fact. Thank you. Alice, would you like to tell us a little bit about how you went about researching and creating this world?
Sure, thank you. I think I do a lot of research when I write a scene and then I realize I don't know X, Y, and Z. So I start researching it based on I already know a dramatic situation. But when I was doing a lot of reading around this book, and there's a bird sanctuary at the end of Fellowship Point with very old golden eagle nests that have been there for a long time. So I started researching about indigenous relationships with eagles, which is very important in Maine and in general. And I found that there's only one place in this country. I think there might be, it's opening up a little bit now, but when I first found out, there was only one place where indigenous people could go get eagle feathers to use in their ceremonies. And they not allowed to kill them, not allowed to raise them. They had to apply to this place. And sometimes an application would take 4 years to go through. So I found this really a fascinating thing. And I ended up using it as a part of the plot in the book. It actually becomes like a big event that happens around this inability for the people, the native people in Maine who are part of this Fellowship Point nearby, trying to get the proper items for their ceremony, including eagle feathers. So that's the kind of thing I found that happened to me a few times, researching also about Quakers, that discovering things that ended up being part of the plot. One other little interesting fact was researching Quakers that there used to be orgies. That was like part of the religion, like in maybe the 1600s. So, true or not, I don't know, but it came into my research.
That is a fascinating fact, and I am intrigued. And my family in Philadelphia will definitely be having me question. Give them that factoid. That was great. Thank you for telling us about that, and for obviously all of the rest all the work that you put into it. Isaac, would you like to talk about researching your own story, your personal family story?
All right, yes. But first, I do want to give a shout out to all my other authors who are killing it. And I know Michael's about to kill it, but the responses on these questions have been fantastic. As somebody, don't get me wrong, and I understand, very different, Quaker versus Shaker. But as a young kid, I was at a shaker situation, and my dad says it was the fastest he ever saw me get naked. And now I'm thinking maybe it was just like part of the vibe. Maybe it was just part of the vibe. But anyways, that is an overshare, which is what a lot of this book is. But I did, to answer your question real quick, that's part of what this book is researching the stories that I was told as a child and trying to figure out the fact from the fiction, or perhaps the fact from the delusion, or perhaps the fact that when it comes to families, there aren't that many facts at all. There are always going to be have different people who have different versions of different stories. And so I didn't even answer your first question, and I realized that while we were going around. So I can answer it now, which is, has my mom read the book? And she has, and my father has too. And I'm in a very lucky position because there is abuse in this book. There are real hard moments in this book, and I am lucky enough to be a person whose family understands that happened. A lot of people that write a book like mine, oftentimes they run into family who say that wasn't true, or you're making too big a deal of it. I'm very lucky in that my parents have read the book and understand that these things did happen. What has been amazing about that, and the research that I've done, talking to them while bringing it to publication, one, just all the stories that I didn't know, all the different, I would always have one half of the story. I'd know kind of the outcome, but I wouldn't really know the why. But was my mother wrote me an email that said, the first email after she finished the book, she said, "I had no idea you were carrying this." And I realized it was because I was giving my family a story too the whole time, which was that everything was fine. And that was a big moment for me. It really hit me because all of a sudden I realized this isn't, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of tough stuff here. Nobody is at their best at many different parts of the book, but I realized I had never taken the time to have the conversations. I just had some of the anger, but I would never actually share it with them or show it to them. And so that was a giant moment for me. Through writing the book, we've actually started to have these conversations, and my mother and I, especially right now, are probably closer than we have ever been, which is not to say, like I said, that the book is wrapped up with a bow. The other thing I found out, which is a wild thing to find out when you're raised in an unhoused situation in Boston, is that I was a direct descendant of somebody that signed the Declaration of Independence. And that felt very, very New England. And then you look him up, and he was famous for doing surgery on himself, which, given how much I don't like to go to the hospital, sometimes you just find out, like, we all grow, we all change, but also sometimes the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I too, when given, I'm like, yeah, no, I can fix that. That could work out. But the reason I actually bring that up too is because truly that was something my parent, like my mother especially, was like, you always knew that. And that's another part of this too, is I think there are moments where you are told something as a child and you forget it over the course of your life, only to rediscover it in your 20s or your 30s. And you realize that your history, like you think of your life, especially when you're young, as just this one contained thing, and actually it touches all these different other things, some of which are problematic, some of which are incredibly heartwarming or make you really understand yourself more, some of which are Quaker orgies, and and you find your way through these stories. And that's all we're doing in a way through living life, is sifting through these stories. So that's what I tried to do with Dirtbag, Massachusetts.
I'm unmuted. Thank you. Thank you. That's a really beautiful answer. Just the way you're talking about sort of returning again and again to the same stories that you feel you know with such certainty, and then are learning them from different angles. I feel like that's such an important, that's just so important in both fiction and memoir. Michael, would you like to talk to us a little bit about your research and how you situated your own story? Like, that's what from reading the beginning, how you're situating your own personal story in like 5,000 or more years of history, and how you went about researching and sort of constructing that and figuring out the structure.
Sure. I mean, there's so many parallels with what everyone's saying, especially Isaac, because the Cooking Gene, my previous book, I didn't want to just write, the same old story of, African American foodways, especially from the South. The story was always black eyed peas, watermelons, and rice. Ain't those Negroes so nice? For their lovely contributions they made without being worked to death. I mean, just like, we can't do this anymore. And for me, it was like, I finally had the chance to go deep on my genetic heritage, which for African Americans is no joke, because most of us were removed from the origin story. It's not just West Africa, it's the Kru or the Mandinka or the Yoruba. And then within those groups, the breakdown of clans and traditions within those ethnic groups. And so for me, like, the whole game of both Kosher Soul and the Cooking Gene was put myself under the microscope. I'm not going to do armchair about somebody else's life, but my own life and life of my ancestors. And, when I did the Cooking Gene, I did my genetic research. I found I had 20 blood cousins, distant cousins, who all had 4 Jewish grandparents who were from Ukraine. So I always heard those stories about, we have Jewish ancestry in our family and blah, 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 blah. And then, the ancestry from the Middle East and North Africa starts showing up. And then this Ashkenazi Ukrainian ancestry. And so, and also I just began to understand that for a lot of, Black families, I remember going to look up some ancestors who didn't appear, but I saw other folks in the Free Negro Registry of Charleston. And there were pages upon pages of Black individuals and families with Cohen, Levy, Portuguese and Spanish names, German names, that were from that Napoleonic era of giving Jews surnames. And so I was like, wait a minute, hold up. This is literally hundreds of people who were, a lot of whom were the children of former slaveholders, et cetera. And it boggled the mind. There were a lot of things I couldn't put in Kosher Soul because, again, I really wanted to do that full-on, definitive thumbnail history. And instead of doing that all in one big chapter, which may or may not have translated, I sprinkled the text with it. So there are references to the fact that there were Jews of African descent in the synagogues of Amsterdam, and there were actually 2 Black synagogues in Suriname that were completely of enslaved Black people. That there were the first Jew of African descent in colonial America that we have record of is named Solomon. And he is profiled and arrested by the police in Boston because he violates the Christian Sabbath, which is not his Sabbath, by walking on the Sabbath to some place. They said, what's up with you? And so they call him Solomon the Mulatto Jew. And so it was fascinating that the first presence of a Black Jewish person in American history is a profile Black brother who just mind his own business. And that's why, I guess, to answer the question previous, I was like, Isaac, I didn't answer the question, I pitched the book. It's, I can't just write the cookbook. I can't just write the food memoir that, I can't just write Eat, Pray, Love, the Black Queer Jewish Southern edition. I can't do that. I mean, once you understand that the first, Black Jewish fellow walking around was profiled and arrested for being different, for being other, you locate yourself in that lineage. And then you go, wait a minute, I can't just talk about the pleasantries of, creating food at the table in the kitchen. I have to talk about the fact that when you deal with poverty, when you deal with sexism, when you deal with homophobia, transphobia, all the ills that we have about ability, about age, you bring the ish with you into the kitchen. The kitchen is where you work, the kitchen table is where you work out a lot of your Sturm und Drang. That's where my grandmother, Alice, was talking about age and women and just people in general. And I remember my grandmother we would talk about what it meant to be older. And how you don't understand. I had a whole life before I was your grandmother. Your mother had a whole life before she was your mother. Your father had a whole life before he was able to make you. It was just like, no, we have existences. And so the kitchen table is where I learned a lot of our culture as Black folks who came from the Great Migration. It was where I learned a lot about the politics of our existence. So when I find people who kind of have that shut up and cook mentality, I know they don't know our culture. I know they don't know the culture of most working class Americans and beyond, where the kitchen is where you work out a lot of your stuff, but it's also where you both receive tradition and create new ones. And so for me, Kosher Soul was an eye-opener in how much we don't really know about the extent to which Jews of African descent have played a role in Western history and American history and history of the Americas, period. Two quick things I want to mention. I don't have any orgy stuff there or anything, but that was amazingly funny and probably true. Don't tell Madison Cawthorn. One was that there were Africans who were enslaved who were trying to get secret Jews out of jail in Mexico who were being persecuted by the Inquisition. And I thought, oh, wow, can we just dig up more information about that? And there are historians who are working that. But also I was intrigued to which the fact that in the South, Deep South, Jews who were Ashkenazi happily accepted the influence of Black women cooks and Black male cooks. But Sephardic Jews in Deep South did not. They typically did not have Black domestics do the cooking. And it dawned on me without anybody saying it, that because they shared black-eyed peas, okra, polenta / mamaliga / grits, eggplant, a number of different foods, tomato, it was that they didn't want to have their traditional foods prepared in very different ways. That was a thing. And I was like, wow, okay. So this is really kind of a one-sided story in some ways. Whereas if you go back in time to the Caribbean, to Charleston and Savannah, New Orleans, the older generation of Sephardic Jews who immigrated to the Americas had heavily absorbed Black cooking, not to the fact where it was like they were making gumbo, they were making black-eyed pea cakes, they were making fried plantain, they were making hot pepper sauce, rice dishes, and to the point where by the time you hit the 19th and 20th centuries, they think of them as just Jewish food. They have no memory of them as West African food, even though they have the same names that they brought from Yoruba and Igbo and other languages from West Africa. So yeah, it's I could write another 15,000 books, and I decided to not write at great length about being a Hebrew school teacher, because I said that's another book. That's just I can't talk about 20 years of teaching Hebrew school across the entire spectrum in this book and do it justice. So yeah, you know, I think every author here has their edit button on when you do these deep dives.
Thank you, Michael. I love the moments where you talk about teaching Hebrew school. Just so please write that book, because I would be very interested in reading that.
That might be the only Hebrew school I could get my son to go to. I wanted to just reflect on what you said. That's so fascinating about the brother who got rolled up by the cops just for walking while black back in the day. But it's interesting and depressing as a historical novelist to find that often the only place you can go to hear people who were otherwise unheard speaking in their own way in completely unedited by whites is in court, in the court documents, when they took verbatim transcripts. And that's where I go to hear women, because they were not allowed to become literate. And it's where I go to hear enslaved people. And it's depressing, but boy, what a resource it is. And usually they are really angry. And I love their anger. And when people say that some of my female characters from the 17th century sound too modern, I just say that's because you haven't read enough court transcripts. We were not the first generation of women to know we were getting a shitty deal.
Thank you for reminding us of the value of archival research and how amazing it is and what things you can discover just by visiting the special collections library that are often around the corner from us, because it really does yield these gems. I think that we are out of time, but thank you all so much for being here. Geraldine, Alice, Isaac, Michael, thank you. I'm really looking forward to your books being in the world this summer. And I again wanted to thank our publisher sponsors. I wanted to thank NABA and SIBA for just creating this time for us to come together. And I really, really, really want to encourage everyone to download these e-galleys. The link is in the chat. Let me see, is there anything I need to see in the chat? It was an amazing conversation. Jennifer Brown, thank you for saying what we're all thinking. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, rest of your night. It was so great meeting you. And thank you again.
No, thank you, Amanda. Come on, let's give it up for Amanda.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.